Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. Hope you're doing well. Just give it one more second. Hopefully you have the source sheet with you, or you've gotten it either through the email or found it online. All right. It's 1:01. I think it's time we can get started. So hello. Happy Thursday afternoon again to everyone. It's nice to have you with me. I'm looking forward to learning this text with you. It's a really interesting one. Though I guess I say that about all of them. They're all interesting, or else we wouldn't be spending time studying them. So let's, again, as I do every session, a little bit of Zoom protocol. You'll notice on the bottom you have a Q&A button, you have a chat function, and then you have the ability to raise your virtual hand. So when we get to the point in the session where we open it up for you to offer your thoughts and your feedback and your interpretations, you can either use the chat, put something in the question and answer for me to address, or you can raise your virtual hand, and that way I can unmute you and you can share your thoughts with me and the rest of the people who are attending. All right. And so we'll run through it. I'll read it once. We'll go back. I'll offer some interpretations, and then we'll open it up for your thoughts and questions and comments. All right. So let's begin with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who has commanded us to engage in the study of Torah. Amen. We have entered the month of Av, the 11th of the months in the Hebrew calendar. We have next Wednesday night, we have Tisha B'Av, which is the only other 24-hour fast day in our Jewish calendar. And if you want to, you can feel free to join us next Wednesday night. Myself, Rabbi Bo Shapiro, and Cantor Lisa Peacock at 8:30 p.m. on our Wilshire Boulevard Temple Facebook page. We're going to be doing a ceremony / ritual combined with a little bit of an interactive component towards the end to mark this day of mourning. I'm pretty sure this is the 18th session, so I have to think back. I'm almost positive we studied the story of Kamsa and Barkhamsa. Yes, we did, which is a famous Talmudic story that is usually linked to Tisha B'Av. So that night, I'm going to review some of that a little. So if you missed that session, whenever that was, you'll be able to learn a little bit about that story and the concept of sinat chinam, senseless hatred. But it really is a day of and a night of mourning and a real opportunity for us just to sit in grief. And so next week, since it will be next Thursday is the day of Tisha B'Av, we will be learning together, and we're going to be looking at a text that's actually a continuation of today's session, and really, I think, is appropriate for that day. So hopefully you'll be back next Thursday to study that with me as well. And of course, hopefully you can join us next Wednesday night. If you've never experienced Tisha B'Av, since most liberal Jews don't necessarily engage in that, for the practical reason that it's during the summer, but also because traditionally it's seen as a holiday that marks the morning of the destruction of the first and second temples, and Reform Judaism has moved away from the concept of the temples being a central element of Jewish identity. But it also marks all the things throughout our history, all the destruction that has been brought upon the Jewish people, and we get to sit in that for 24 hours before we move towards a sense of hope. So hopefully you can join us for that. Okay, on to our text this week. This week we are looking at a fascinating question that the rabbis ask. Does God pray? And if God does pray, what is God's prayer? I don't know if you've asked yourself that before. We all pray, not all of us, maybe, but I would say our tradition emphasizes the idea that we as humans have sometimes a responsibility, but at least the opportunity to pray to God. And you could have a whole class on what is prayer and how we connect to prayer. But the rabbis are asking, well, what about God? So that's what we're going to look at today, the question and the answer. And so I want you to be thinking about, and the reason I'm bringing this to you today is because the longer that we're sitting in this quarantine and this pandemic, there are these moments where I'm just feeling depleted and it just feels monotonous. And yes, I love being at home, but I look around, and last week when the Los Angeles Unified School District decided that they are only going to be remote in the fall, that there are continuing rising levels of COVID infections in at least Los Angeles, but all over the country, that those are things that really have just been getting me down and depressing me, and making me very sad about the state of the world that we're living in right now. And so I'm praying in different ways. I've always been someone who's connected to prayer, but now I'm trying to re-examine my own prayer rituals and my understanding of prayer. And when I thought about this text, I thought this is a perfect thing, not only for me to remember, but also something that I thought all of you could also explore. All right, so let's get to it. And then of course we'll open it up because I'm very curious your thoughts. Okay, here we go. Nope, that's not the right one. This one right here. Okay. Brachot 7a, the section Brachot meaning blessings. Okay, it's towards the very beginning of Brachot, which is actually the first section of the Talmud. Said Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yossi, how do we know that the Holy One, blessed be he, says prayers? Since it is said, even then, them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer, from Isaiah. Their house of prayer is not stated, but rather my house of prayer. On the basis of that usage, we see that the Holy One, blessed be he, says prayers. What prayers does he say? Said Rabbi Zutra bar Tobiah, said Rab, may it be my will that my mercy overcome my anger, and that my mercy prevail over my attributes, so that I may treat my children in accord with the trait of mercy, and in their regard go beyond the strict measure of the law. It has been taught on Tanaite authority, said Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha, one time I went into the Holy of Holies to offer up incense on the innermost altar, and I saw Akatriel Yah Adonai Tzvaot enthroned on the highest throne. He said to me, Ishmael, my son, bless me. I said to him, may it be your will that your mercy overcome your anger, and that your mercy prevail over your attributes, so that you treat your children in accord with the trait of mercy, and in their regard go beyond the strict measure of the law. And he nodded his head to me. And from that story we learn never to underestimate the blessing offered by an ordinary person. Okay, short passage. We're going to continue next week with what comes next, which, just a little preview, is about God's anger, but we're not going to focus on that today. Here we're learning, does God pray? Yes, God prays, based on a passage from Isaiah. We're going to go through this, and we'll go through the text in detail in a second. And then what's so remarkable about this text is not only does God pray, and the rabbis imagine what God's prayer is. And so I want you to be thinking about God's prayer and what are we supposed to learn from this prayer that the rabbis imagine God is offering. And on top of that, then there's a story about the high priest who goes into the Holy of Holies, and he sees God there, and God asks him for a prayer. And the rabbi, the priest, offers that prayer back to God, and God accepts that prayer. There's a lot here. There's probably no way we're going to be able to get into every element of this, but there's the concept of prayer in general, the purpose and efficacy of prayer, the fact that God is praying, what are the elements and key values that are articulated in God's prayer, who is God praying to, and what is the purpose of God praying, period. Then there's the added layer of, do we as humans actually have the opportunity to bless God and offer a prayer for God? And then this idea that God accepts our prayer that we are offering on behalf of God. And then their final line, that this means that, every we should not underestimate the blessing offered by an ordinary person, okay? Lots of layers here. So I want you to be thinking about not only your own relationship with God as we're reading this, because you read this differently depending on how you understand God in the world. But I think beyond that, there are lessons that we're supposed to take from this that actually are irrelevant when it comes, that are not at all related. I shouldn't say irrelevant, that are not at all related to whether or not you believe in God, but there are values that are being taught through these stories. And so what are those values? Because I think that's what I'd like us to focus on, especially given where we are in the world. Okay, so let's go back and look at it one more time. We'll go through it, and then I would love to hear your interpretations and thoughts. Okay, so we have this rabbi. He says, how do we know that God says prayers? And it's all based, the proof text for that comes from Isaiah 56, Isaiah chapter 56. And by the way, Isaiah chapter 57 is what we read on Yom Kippur. So this just comes a little bit before the passage that we read from the Haftorah on Yom Kippur Day. It doesn't say their house of prayer, it says my house of prayer. So their proof text is that because in that text right here where God says my house of prayer, therefore that means that based on the usage, we see that the Holy One says prayers because God is praying. It's not just something that other people do, but my house of prayer is supposed to imagine this idea that therefore God prays as well. So that's the proof text. So now we have set, based on that first paragraph, yes, God prays. According to the passage from Isaiah, we have proof, therefore, that God prays. But what is God's prayer? Right? It's a fascinating question. We could do a whole creative writing exercise to think about if God was to pray, what would God's prayer be? And would you come up with this? This is what the rabbis came up with. This is God's prayer that God offers. May it be my will that my mercy overcome my anger. So I just want to pause on the word mercy. The word mercy in the text itself, in the original text, is rachamim. Rachamim means mercy or compassion. It comes from the root rechem. Rechem means womb, as in where a baby is formed and created before it is birthed into the world. And so already we have this idea that God is praying about God's mercy or compassion, overcoming his anger. And already we have built into this, if you think about the root of the word, this idea of a womb is that God's relationship with us, since most of this prayer is not only about God's self, but God's relationship to us as humans, is that is a blending of a parent and something bigger than a parent, right? The idea of a womb is a place of comfort, of safety and security. And that's the virtue that God is asking to enlighten God's life and to really be the formative value that God is bringing into the world. But I'm also thinking about the fact, and maybe I'm thinking about this because my kids are at home and I'm spending a lot of time near them. And there are those moments where you feel this pure joy and the love of being a parent. And there are those other moments where you realize you have given birth to someone that is both of you and completely independent and different from you, right? Their own personality, their own way in the world, that there is this constant struggle that I think those of us who are parents, no matter how old your children are, struggle with that balance between recognition that this child is of me and yet they are on their own path. And that's built into this concept of mercy, and especially in the Hebrew, this idea of rachamim. And here God is saying, I'm praying that the value of mercy is going to overcome my anger, and that my mercy prevail over my other attributes, so that I may treat my children, humans, in accord with that trait of mercy, and in their regard go beyond the strict measure of the law, not to get caught up in when they make mistakes, my desire or my intuition to just get angry at them. All of us have those moments, not just as parents, but when we see people on TV, we see people on social media, we see people on the news where we really want to get angry and we want to yell out at them. We want to, we've talked about this theme before. Here, God is saying, please, me, God, may I have the ability to have mercy overrule my anger. I think it's a beautiful prayer. And I think what's built into that obviously from this text, the way I read it is, this is a prayer for us. This is, if God is offering this prayer, then how much the more so are we supposed to be offering this prayer? And that we need to take this on, that this idea that the value of compassion and mercy is supposed to reign supreme, especially in those moments where we feel the urge for anger, resentment, painful retribution. All of those things may well up inside us, but just like God prays for God's ability to temper that with mercy, so too should we. So I read that into this prayer, and I'm curious to see what else from all of you, what you read into that, if there are other interpretations that you come with as well. Then we continue. It's been taught, the rabbis teach, that one time I went into the Holy of Holies. The only person who goes really into the Holy of Holies is the high priest, and the only time the high priest does that is on Yom Kippur. Went into the Holy of Holies to offer up incense in the innermost altar, and I saw God enthroned on the highest throne. Now, this name of God, Yah, we've heard Adonai, Tzvaot is another name. This Katriel is this whole idea of the crown of God. Okay, so it's not clear if God takes a human form or not, but in some way, there's this human connection between God and this high priest. And God says to this man, "My son, bless me." Not very often do we imagine God asking us for a blessing. But here the rabbis are teaching us that there was this moment where God even asks us to bless God. And what is the blessing that Ishmael gives to God? He says, "May it be your will that your mercy overcome your anger and that your mercy prevail over your attributes, so that you treat your children in accord with the trait of mercy, and in their regard go beyond the strict measure of the law." In other words, the same prayer that God offers God's self is the prayer that Ishmael offers God in return. And God nods his head in accepting that prayer. So why is it that Ishmael offers the same prayer? Is it also that, doubling down according to this passage, that we have to not only offer this prayer to ourselves, but we also have a responsibility, depending on how we understand our relationship with God, to offer that prayer to God, that we also want a world in which mercy overcomes anger, and that somehow, if we can offer that prayer out into the world and direct it towards God, not necessarily, I think, in a modern concept would we assume that God is then going to come down and bring miracles to answer that prayer. But yet, if we were all to be putting out that prayer, how powerful would that be? Right? There is that research that suggests that prayer does have the power to help people heal. But prayer also has the incredible power of helping us focus our values and to focus on what really matters. And when we get caught up in the craziness of the world, prayer is a way to hone in on what really matters. And if this is the one prayer that this human is giving to God, how much the more so, yet again, I say, for us to really be embodying this prayer ourselves. From the story, we learn never to underestimate the blessing offered by an ordinary person. So even here, the way the rabbis end this section of the teaching is that every person has the ability to offer a blessing of significance. It's not just the rabbi who offers a blessing. It's not just the Kohanim, the priestly class, who offer the priestly benediction in more traditional synagogues. This is the idea that every single person has the opportunity to offer blessings, not only to one another, but even blessings to God, and that God can accept those blessings. No matter how you understand your relationship with God, the idea that we also have the responsibility of not only engaging in difficult conversations with other people, but instead of cursing others, we need to be blessing others. And that can sometimes be very difficult for us to do. But a blessing can take the form of, I really am hoping that you will act like this instead of that. That, in a way, according to this passage, is a type of blessing that you can be offering someone else, even someone with whom you completely disagree, or for whom you have deep resentment or anger. That can we move away from the idea of cursing those around us? And right now, I feel like that is the That's the momentum that's being pushed out into the world, is these ideas of curses. Not only is it behind the idea of the plague that has come upon our world, but we are responding to one another more with curses than we are with blessings. And this text, in the time where we are supposed to be feeling, where we may be feeling an urge to curse, this text is teaching us that we must bless. And the blessing is to be both inward to ourselves, to say, please, may I have the ability to have compassion and mercy. And may that override my desire to be angry. So it's not a long passage, but for me, it's really speaking to me right now, because there have been times where I've been watching the news and I've wanted to curse. And if I can really take this in, then I know that that's good work that I can be doing, not only to benefit myself and my own state of mind, my emotional well-being, but also if I can help spread that message with the way in which I interact with other people, through us learning this text together and you spreading that concept within yourself and others, then we can spread the antidote and the vaccine to this pandemic, which could be this sense of mercy and compassion and the real desire to overcome our anger, and not to let people get away with things necessarily, but to really work on the concept of blessing others instead of cursing them. So with that, I'd love to hear your own thoughts, questions, interpretations. So Sukasa, let's start with you. How are you?
One is sort of a comment. Interesting that, I guess I'm not on the screen. Hang on a sec.
On this format, we only hear you. We don't see.
Oh, okay. Okay. So that the person's name was Ishmael. That's one thing that's kind of interesting, that he would pick that name, the rabbis.
And why is that interesting to you?
Well, because the twins, and Ishmael is the start, the forerunner of Islam, isn't he? Am I wrong?
Yeah.
I'm right or I'm wrong?
Yes. No, you're right. You're right.
Yeah. And so that I found that kind of strange. That's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to ask is, now there's this order for masks, and it's very hard for me when I see people walking around that do not have masks and who are endangering me. And this is on a personal level. Forget on the TV with the politics and stuff like that. Very hard. I mean, what are you saying about? Am I supposed to have mercy for these people? I don't get that.
Well, yes. I think you are supposed to have mercy for them, because I think unfortunately, we're living at a time where there's a lot of mixed messaging. So it's not to say that those people shouldn't be taking responsibility and wearing masks, but I think what's really complicated about this, and I'm not an expert in both the politics, of course, and what's going on in everyone's minds, but my interpretation of that is that we're living in a space where a lot of people have been given the independence to make a decision. And that's because the leadership at large has given mixed messages. And when there's mixed messages from leadership, people struggle to find their own way. And they are left in a very independent American kind of way to create their own path based on what they think is important for themselves. And again, I think we're also moving into a time right now where individualism is far surpassing the collective good. And mask wearing is an example of that. And actually, I'm going to be talking about tomorrow night in Shabbat services about this idea of the collective versus the personal, because I think we're focusing a little bit too much on the individual, and we're forgetting that for example, the fact that we're not able to reopen in Los Angeles and that basically all the schools are going to be closed is the result of the collective not recognizing the importance of going on one path together. So yes, I do think that there is the need to hold people responsible, and I think there is the ability to courteously ask people to abide by the rules that are set up by our government, at least our local government. And I think there's also, unfortunately, a lot of mixed messaging out there that has led our city and our country to be all over the place. And I don't think that can even be pinned down to one leader. I think that's a systemic challenge. And I think it's going to be a systemic challenge that we're going to have to deal with even after there's a vaccine, et cetera, that this is a long-term challenge that we face as a nation. And so I feel that there's that tension that exists, even though I'm, of course, a firm believer in wearing masks and everyone should. So that's where I stand. In terms of Ishmael, the name itself also is related to this idea of listening and God, El. Anytime you see the suffix El in a name, it's a name for God. And so I think it's more that it's a popular name, and the idea of Islam came much later down the line in terms of, Ishmael in the beginning of the Torah itself. It's not necessarily setting up, the Torah wasn't setting up Islam in the Torah, in the story of Ishmael in the beginning there. So those are just a few thoughts. Thank you, Sukasa. Abby. Hi, Abby.
Okay, for me, I think it is very beautiful. It really is. And it's very uplifting and hopeful, this prayer. And for me also, I think it has to do with what your concept of God is. And just, my concept of God is that God is within our souls, okay? So for me, I'm looking at this in a lot of different ways, even like Sukasa mentioned that the Ishmael, well, God sort of, he blessed Isaac, not Ishmael, right? It was sort of a mistake. So we need to have compassion, and I'm just looking at this, that, I think it's a really wonderful prayer to think about, because if we can have compassion, forgiveness for people, then we have peace, at least peace within ourselves.
Absolutely. Thank you, Abby. Yes, I agree. I mean, I think one way, a really important way we can be understanding this idea is that the prayer, when God is praying initially, not when Ishmael offers the prayer to God, but when God is offering this prayer, is God praying? Who's God praying to? God's not praying to some other God. God's praying to God's self. I think built into this is also a potential tutorial on how we're supposed to understand prayer. That prayer is not necessarily about praying to something out there, but that a lot of what prayer is about internal work. It's about praying about ourselves in the complexity of the human condition, and trying to figure out and navigate the pathway towards getting back to a sense of values and what matters to us. And that prayer helps us navigate that and helps us get back to that, because we get lost. And prayer every single day, even though the repetition of some of the prayers that we find multiple times a day are there to constantly remind us, you may stray off the path, but let's get back on. It's not just on Yom Kippur when we're supposed to be doing that work every single day. And here God seems to be doing that work with God's self. So thank you very much.
Oh, because I just wanted to add one more thing, is that because I believe God is within ourselves, that I don't really see God as somewhere out there. I see it within me. And I think, that's my concept of God. So that, and he does give us that free will to be compassionate. That's all I wanted to add.
Okay. Thank you, Abby. Appreciate it. Okay, Steve.
I love this passage. I just love this passage. There could not be a deeper, more beautiful example of the partnership that humankind has with God. I remember how shocked I was when somebody said years ago that God needs us. We're certainly used to we needing God, but the concept that God needs us, God runs low on gas also, and that we and God, Adonai is one. The one is everything, and that we're a system. but this is just put so beautifully and so succinctly that I just marvel at it, and it warms me up.
Thank you. Yes, and there is a speaking of that idea of God needing us. Heschel's book, God in Search of Man, is a great book for anyone who hasn't read that one. Of course, there are a lot of great Heschel books, but that, along with others who really see, and Buber, who see this idea that this is about a relationship, and even in this story that we have in this text is about a relationship between humanity and God, and the ability for us to empower God, that we are not just passive observers or recipients of God's will, but that we are in relationship with God. And I think that is supposed to then help us understand how we are supposed to be in relationship with one another. That the majority of the things that we actually pray about, I keep coming back to Yom Kippur, maybe because I'm starting to be in the high holiday mindset, but most of what we pray about and ask for forgiveness for are not things about our relationship with God. It's really mostly al chet shechatanu lefanecha, about the ways in which we have harmed other people. That our relationship with God is supposed to model how we're supposed to understand our relationship with one another. And I think this text does a nice job of helping frame the way in which we're supposed to see that relationship. So thank you. Jeff. Hi, Jeff.
I'm unmuting. Thank you.
Yes.
Couple of things strike me about the use of language here.
Okay.
Number one, this is a commentary on how humans can resist their reactionary behavior. Prayer and mercy forces an individual to stop and consider and not be a reactionary person. It, in essence, encourages us to stop, if necessary, the still small voice, or even using words out loud in the prayers that we say, whether it's for Yom Kippur or otherwise on a daily basis or never, is to allow us to resist the temptations that God is resisting by saying, let me use my mercy rather than my other characteristics of judgment and reactionary behavior to the things that he sees or the things that we see, as you've already commented upon. The reactionary behavior needs to be the issue that gets resisted by stopping for just a moment and thinking about your reaction and response on a higher level. Whether you call it mercy or whether you call it anything else, it's an ability to be better within ourselves in our ability to react to our society, our situation, our lifestyle, our everything.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, I love that. I also, it makes me think, what if all of us were to offer a prayer right before we react to someone or to something that we see that brings up any negative feeling? Even if that prayer is very short, there is that, it's a filter, right? It's a stopgap measure that maybe one of the real powers of prayer is that, as we know, just like Shabbat is supposed to represent on a weekly basis, prayer has the ability to just slow us down and reset, as we were talking, and as I said already. But it would be interesting for all of us, and I'm going to think about doing this myself, if what if before responding to something, we offered a prayer, and it was a prayer similar to what God's prayer is to God's self. What if it's as simple as, grant me mercy over anger, compassion over anger, right? Something as simple as that, it could potentially shift things. And so it's something to keep in mind. And I think it doesn't just refer to, it's not something you only have to try in those moments where you're starting to get agitated. It can be, of course, as we do every single morning with the daily blessings, you see something, even literally when you open your eyes. Thank you, God, for opening my eyes, for my eyes opening. Thank you, God, for the sun. Whatever it may be, this is supposed to be built into our daily rhythm. So it's like exercise. So thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. Hi, Susan.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay. This is such an interesting discussion, and there seems so many facets of it. I really felt like Sukasa about the masks and the partying. And I hear you for leaders, but individuals have responsibility too, to think about that, and they're endangering everyone by the partying and that and not keeping that physical distance. In terms of mercy, I thought of, there's a story of Rabbi Meir and his wife Buria that I heard years ago about. I mean, you could tell it if you remember it, with rowdies outside his house, and he was cursing them, and then his wife Buria calmed him down. It's often women calming down. And to the point, if I remember correctly, that she suggested or got him to reach out to the kids and teach them better behavior. Is that something applicable here? And then I had some other things for blessing God with gratitude. I mean, that seems to be some of the, and then acting in godly ways as showing others the blessings of God. And then I think before Heschel and Buber, the Kabbalah, that God needs us to partner with God. And then on the opposite side, forgiveness and mercy. I really dislike it when people say, family members say, I forgive this person who murdered my child. They have no right to forgive and to show mercy there. So what do you say about the limits of mercy? I gave you a whole bunch of things.
Well, yeah. Wow. So I wish I had written all those down. The limits of mercy. That's a tough one, because you said you don't believe that someone has the right to forgive someone for murdering their child.
That's right.
Or murdering someone else. But I guess I would push back and say, what if they want to forgive? Why don't they have the right to do that? It's obviously very complicated. Actually, there are many examples, though, of organizations and people who've gotten together who have offered forgiveness to one another after terrorist attacks, and that there is something very powerful if you can get there. And I think the ultimate goal is forgiveness. And I think Yom Kippur is the reminder, and the high holidays are a reminder that we need to be yearning for forgiveness. It doesn't mean that you're going to do it in every case, that there are limits, and some of those limits are out of your control. And sometimes they are based on your own limitations. And I think, it's a little, I don't want to go there because I think it's really a case by case basis, but I think our tradition does believe that forgiveness is a freeing mechanism, that resentment and holding grudges is something that our tradition frowns upon for the most part, because it is more destructive than it is growth oriented. And that I believe that our tradition is about growth, personal and communal growth. And when there are too many people who are unwilling to forgive, and if a society were to create a system in which forgiveness is lower on the hierarchy of interactions, then I think that causes more problems than it does good. So I think, yes, there are of course situations where forgiveness does not make sense, or you can't get there for one reason or another. But I think overall, I think there is a responsibility to see that mercy and compassion are to be at the utmost level of how we're supposed to understand the world in which we're living. And that if we can do that, we're more likely to get to a place of peace and of prosperity than otherwise. So that I'll leave it at that, but you bring up a really good point. You brought up a lot of other points, but I don't remember all of them. So you and I can have another time where we can talk about some of those. So thank you for bringing all those up. Lisa Beth, hi.
Sorry. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, hi, nice to see you.
See, we'll
I
hear
have
you.
a kind of, yeah, sorry. I have a follow-up question, to this notion of, stopping before you react and, trying to give mercy to someone. So I think this is all a wonderful conversation, but it's a little, for me, it's a little too sterile, meaning that we're not discussing the emotions that go along with being hurt, being treated badly, the emotional content. And, I'm wondering what our tradition says about, or this passage, when, you really need the other person to know exactly how they hurt you. And there's going to be emotion in it. I often say things like, everything is not a strategic communications, or a corporate communications kind of memo. There's also a reason why we have such a deep emotional life. And sometimes you need somebody to hear it in that way, and so I'm wondering about the reality of that versus this lovely academic notion that you're supposed to sort of sit back and, always calmly have a conversation with someone who could have really, really hurt you, whether it's physically, emotionally, or otherwise.
Yeah, yes, I hear what you're saying. It's a good critique. I think in this setting, I don't think we're removing emotion. I think even built into the two key words that are a part of God's prayer, which are mercy/compassion and anger, those are purely about emotion. And so, I'm not suggesting that this is saying that you need to remove all emotion and you need to remove all anger in order to bring compassion, and that only positivity is the way in which you're supposed to live in the world. I think this is this is an ideal. This is not something that we are supposed to assume we can easily get to, nor is it ever potentially attainable. If this is God's prayer, then maybe only God can attain that. But if we are offering that prayer to God, then that is something that we need to be striving for. It doesn't mean that there are people and experiences that have caused us great anger and pain and anguish, and we should therefore negate those elements of the experience in order to find compassion. It is to try and understand in our lives in general. And there are, as I said earlier, there may be certain situations where that's not possible. But in general, can we live a life in which compassion overrides anger? In other words, do we go through the day being angry and resentful? If we were really to look in the mirror and see how we look at ourselves, at others, how we see the world, what kind of lens are we seeing that world in and seeing ourselves in and seeing the people around us in? And is there a way that we can slowly move that in a direction that, according to our tradition, I believe, and this is my interpretation, is suggesting that that is not a great place to stay. That won't do you much good. What will do you good is to slowly move into a more compassionate space and to come up individually with a strategy that can guide you in that direction, or to be a part of a community that talks about values. And that's why I think, therefore, the value of being a part of a Jewish community where you are not only inspired, but also held responsible. That part of this is holding ourselves and each other responsible for moving from anger to compassion. And when we see other people doing things wrong, or when we see other people who allow anger to overcome their compassion, how can we appropriately remind them that they are on the wrong path? There are things that come with this, and the harder, I think it's becoming harder and harder, because not only are we now physically distant, so now we're not having the interaction, but already before this pandemic, we were setting ourselves up to be more individual and to be more siloed. Right. And that's why synagogue life has been fading over the course all over the country, because we have been moving more and more into our silos. And I think another piece of this, if you're a part of a community or you are in conversations that can help guide you, I think that can help. So it's not to negate the individual experiences where you can't get to a place of compassion. Of course, those exist, but I think it's supposed to be a guide. Hold on. Let's see. Randy Grana, do we have compassion, or does it need to be taught? How do we teach it? Good question from Randy Grant on Facebook. Yes, I think it's something that needs to be taught. I think that's why the rabbis include it here. I think that's why the concept of rachamim is included in our prayers, in what the values that our tradition is teaching us. I think one of the ways we teach it, I know this sounds so obvious, but is to model it and to model it for others, and to even talk to others about the process of our struggle. Look, I'm really angry at you now. I really am pissed off, and I really want to rip you to shreds. However, I'm really working on trying to be more compassionate, and I want to understand why you did that, or why you believe this, or why did you not put on a mask? I'm just curious, because it bothers me that you have decided that that's not a responsibility for you to take on. Can you explain to me why you believe that? Again, in previous sessions, we've talked about the concept in our tradition of asking questions, of debate, of criticism, of having those somewhat scary and unnerving and vulnerable moments where we ask questions or we engage in conversations that aren't so cut and dry and sterile, as Lisa Beth was mentioning, and that we need to be doing that more, and we need to be doing it in a productive way. And we're not being trained, and we don't have great guidance on social media and around us necessarily to do that. But I do think we can start with the people closest to us and go from there. Thank you. Carol. Hi, Carol. Carol, can you want to unmute? No. Okay. I thought Carol had her hand up. So let me see. I think there were a few other questions. People have free will. Just trying to glance at the other things before we close it down. Okay, I think that covers most of things. I know there are probably other comments. I do appreciate, I think this is great. You're right, this is not easy stuff. And this is my perspective where I am right now, and you're in your place where you are right now. And we have to honor those things. And we also need to be pushing ourselves and each other, just like you push me. And I want to push all of you, and we need to be doing this work together. And so my prayer, I will end with the prayer which we find in this text. I'm going to put it up for us so that we can look at it and offer it. May it be your will that your mercy overcome your anger, and that your mercy prevail over your attributes, so that you treat your children in accord with the trait of mercy, and in their regard go beyond the strict measure of the law. Or if we want to put it to ourselves, may it be my will that my mercy overcome my anger, and that my mercy prevail over my attributes, so that I may treat my children and those around me in accord with the trait of mercy, and in their regard go beyond the strict measure of the law. May that be all of our will. May we find the strength and fortitude to move both personally and collectively more towards compassion, rachamim, mercy, and to continue to struggle with that anger that does reside within us. And I hope we can continue to build a community that will support one another, and may the whole world be on that path towards mercy. So thank you all very much. Next week, we are going to continue this conversation, because right after this, the next question is about God's anger. And we are going to be looking at that on Tisha B'Av, a perfect day, since it is a day about destruction, to be really understanding what do the rabbis say about God's anger and how God shows God's anger, because we've just been talking about anger here and it was in God's prayer. So now let's go into that a little bit more in depth. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. Again, thank you. Thank you for all your comments and questions and insights. It fills me, and wishing you an early Shabbat Shalom and a peaceful and healthy weekend. So thank you all very much. Bye.
Shabbat